Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
Awesome. Today, we're heading into a landscape that seems, well, pretty impossible for most life.
Yeah?
The desert,
Yeah.
scorching sun, limited water.
Right, where every drop counts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But trust me, there's a whole lot more going on beneath the surface than you might think. We're diving into some fascinating research today, a paper called Contrasting Responses to Aridity by Different-Sized Decomposers cause similar decomposition rates across a precipitation gradient.
Wow, okay, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is, huh? But don't worry, the findings are way more exciting than the title. This research tackles what scientists are calling the Dryland decomposition conundrum.
Ah, yes, the conundrum. Basically, for years, researchers have been scratching their heads over this.
Over what?
Over the fact that decomposition, the breakdown of dead plants and organic matter, it happens at a pretty similar rate in places with drastically different amounts of rainfall.
You mean like from bone-dry deserts to those kind of wetter Mediterranean climates?
Exactly. You'd think decomposition would be way slower in those super arid regions, hardly any moisture.
Right, because microbes, those microscopic decomposers, they need water to do their thing.
Totally. Imagine trying to bake bread without any yeast.
Okay, yeah, I get it. So how is decomposition in drylands keeping up with the wetter environments? What's the answer to this conundrum?
Well, that's what these researchers wanted to find out. So they set up this really cool experiment across 7 sites in Israel, all with varying levels of precipitation.
7 sites, that's commitment.
Yeah, they were dedicated. And they wanted to really isolate the roles of different types of decomposers in this whole process.
Okay, so how do they do that?
Imagine sifting flour. Different sieves separate out fine particles from the coarser ones,
Right.
Well, they did something similar. They used these litter baskets, but with varying mesh sizes to separate the decomposers.
I see. So some baskets only let in the tiniest guys, the microorganisms.
Right. And then other baskets let in slightly bigger decomposers, what we call mesofauna things like mites and springtails. And then, of course, some baskets had the big guys, the macrofauna. Beetles, termites.
Okay, so they've got their sieves or litter baskets all set. What did they put in them?
They used dried grass from a species called Stipa capensis, which conveniently grows in all the sites they were studying.
Ah, smart. Keep the type of litter consistent.
Exactly, no variables there. They let these baskets decompose out in the field for a whole year.
And I'm guessing they were especially interested in what was going on with those macrofauna.
You got it. They use these pitfall traps to keep an eye on those guys.
Pitfall traps?
Yeah, basically to monitor how abundant they were, their biomass, the diversity of macro decomposers at each site. It was a whole operation.
I bet. So what did they find? Let's start with the microbes. Were they behaving as expected?
Well, those microbes weren't exactly having a pool party in the desert heat,
Right, not exactly prime conditions for them.
Yeah, especially in the driest sites, microbial decomposition was practically non-existent during those scorching summer months.
Makes sense. Not enough moisture.
But then, come winter, things changed. Once the rains came, their activity shot up. And it was clear that the wetter the site, the busier those microbes were.
Interesting. Okay, so microbes followed the classic pattern, thriving with moisture. What about those mesofauna? Same story.
Well, not quite. Their activity followed what we call a hump-shaped pattern along the precipitation gradient.
A hump-shaped pattern.
Yeah, so picture this. You've got a graph. One axis shows precipitation levels, the other shows mesofauna activity. Now, instead of a straight line going up, you get this hump. The line rises, peaks somewhere in the middle, then drops back down.
Well, I get it. So their activity doesn't just increase with precipitation. There's a sweet spot, somewhere in the middle.
Exactly. Seems like those mesofauna are more adapted to drier environments than microbes, but they still need some moisture to function at their best.
Fascinating. So not too dry, not too wet, just right for the mesofauna. All right, time for the main event. The macrofauna. What were they up to?
This is where things get really exciting. It turns out those beetles, termites, and their buddies, they were the real MVPs of arid decomposition.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What were they doing that was so special?
Well, while those microbes were struggling in the dry summer heat, especially in those most arid sites, the macro decomposers were just getting started.
Really? So the microbes were taking a siesta and the macrofauna were waiting to party?
You could say that. Their activity actually peaked in those arid sites during those dry summer months, perfectly timed to kind of make up for the lack of microbial activity.
Wait, hold on. So you're telling me that the arid sites were decomposing just as much as the wetter sites over the entire year, Even with those super dry summers, how is that even possible?
It's pretty amazing, right? It just shows you how resilient and adaptable life can be, even when things get tough. Remember those pitfall traps I mentioned?
Yeah, the ones tracking the macrofauna.
Right. Well, those traps showed us that not only were those macro decomposers more active in the arid environments, there were also more of them. The abundance, the biomass, the diversity all peaking in those arid sites.
It's like they're saying, bring on the heat. But how? How are they thriving in these dry conditions where others struggle?
Ah, that's the question, isn't it?
Paper.
And it gets to the heart of what makes macrofauna so fascinating. They've developed these incredible adaptations to deal with the challenges of aridity. One of their main strategies is what we call microclimate manipulation.
Microclimate manipulation. Sounds a little fancy for a beetle. What does that even mean?
It's actually pretty straightforward. It's their ability to create these little pockets of favorable conditions within their environment. Think
Right.
about it. The surface of the desert gets insanely hot and dry, but just a little ways below ground, things are much cooler and more humid.
So they're going underground to escape the heat, like finding a cool basement on a scorching day.
Exactly. A lot of these macrofauna are expert burrowers. They create these tunnels and chambers that provide refuge from those harsh surface conditions. It's like they've built their own little oases under the desert floor.
I love that. A subterranean spa for desert decomposers. But wait, some macrofauna, like termites, they don't burrow, do they? They build those mounds above ground.
That's right. Termites are a great example of macrofauna creating their own microclimates above ground. Those mounds are incredible, real feats of engineering. They have ventilation systems that regulate temperature and humidity, creating a stable environment inside, even when it's wildly fluctuating outside.
Wow. So they're not just decomposers, they're architects and engineers too.
It is pretty remarkable. And here's another cool thing. Those underground havens and climate-controlled mounds, they don't just benefit the macrofauna. They also provide refuge for other decomposers, like those microbes, that might not be able to handle the harsh conditions on the surface.
Ah, so it's like they're creating these little hotspots of decomposition activity beneath the desert.
Exactly. These macrofauna are like ecosystem engineers, modifying their environment in ways that benefit everyone. It's a beautiful example of how interconnected life really is.
This is all so incredible, but I'm curious. The researchers found that even with all these amazing macropaunas hard at work, decomposition rates were still lower in the hyperarid sites. Why do you think that is?
That's a great point, and it really shows that even the most adaptable creatures have their limits. In those super dry conditions, the availability of resources, especially things like dead plant matter, becomes a major limiting factor.
Makes sense. Even if you're a master of water conservation and microclimate manipulation, if there's not enough food to go around, you're going to struggle.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that life is resilient, but it also depends on this delicate balance of resources and conditions. And that balance can be easily disrupted, especially as our climate continues to change.
That's a sobering thought. What does all this mean for the future of dryland ecosystems, especially as they face more and more aridity because of climate change?
That's the big question, isn't it? If we lose these crucial macro decomposers because of habitat loss or a changing climate, it could have a domino effect on the entire ecosystem.
Right, because they're keeping the nutrient cycle going in those dry conditions.
Right. Without them breaking down dead plant matter and putting nutrients back into the soil, the desert could become even less productive, leading to less plant growth, less biodiversity, and a decline in how the whole ecosystem functions.
It's like a delicate house of cards.
Yeah,
And the macro decomposers are holding it all together.
a good analogy. This research really emphasizes how important it is to understand and protect these often overlooked creatures. They're playing a vital role in keeping dryland ecosystems healthy and resilient.
Definitely food for thought.
Yeah.
So, what's next for this line of research? What other mysteries are they hoping to uncover?
One thing they're really interested in is the role of diversity within the macro decomposer community. Remember we talked about how not all macropaunas are created equal?
Right, some are better at certain things, some are more active at certain times.
Exactly. They believe that having a diverse team of macro decomposers ensures that someone's always on the job no matter what challenges come up. Like having a team of specialists with different skills ready to tackle any decomposition task.
So the more diverse the team, the more resilient the ecosystem.
That's the idea. To test it, they're going to manipulate the diversity of macro decomposers in experimental plots, create communities with different levels of species richness, and see how they perform under different environmental conditions.
So they're creating these mini ecosystems to study the impact of diversity in a controlled way, like a real-life laboratory for understanding these complex interactions.
Precisely. And what they learn from this will be super valuable for conservation efforts, helping ensure the long-term health of these vital dryland ecosystems.
It's amazing how much we're learning about this hidden world beneath our feet. I'm already excited to hear what they discover next. But before we get ahead of ourselves, you mentioned something earlier about those two arid sites, Avdat and Sarit Shaked. Didn't they have similar rainfall levels?
They did. But even though they experience a similar overall climate, the macro-decomposer communities in those two sites showed some interesting differences, especially when it came to those seasonal shifts we were talking about.
Okay, so same arid climate, but different patterns of seasonal change in those macro-decomposer communities. Tell me more.
So those seasonal shifts in the macro-decomposer community, how those different species kind of take turns depending on the time of year.
Right, like different teams stepping up based on the conditions.
Exactly. Those shifts were much more noticeable in Sarit Shaked. They saw big changes in what kinds of macrofauna were there in the summer versus winter.
Yeah, a lot of turnover throughout the year.
And Avdat.
Avdat was surprisingly stable. Their macro-decomposer community stayed pretty much the same across the seasons. Same types of species hanging out in both summer and winter.
Wow, that's so interesting. Same arid climate, similar rainfall, but totally different patterns of change happening in those communities. What do you think is going on there? It just goes to show how even tiny little differences in the environment can have a huge impact on which species do well and when. You see, even within this broad category of arid climate, you can have these subtle variations in microclimate.
Microclimate. You mean those little pockets of slightly different conditions, like within the bigger environment?
Exactly. Things like the type of soil, how much vegetation there is, even slight changes in elevation. They can create these unique microhabitats that favor certain species over others, like different neighborhoods in a city, each with their own unique character and residence.
Oh, I see. So even in the seemingly uniform landscape like the desert, there's all this hidden diversity just waiting to be discovered.
Absolutely. And those microclimate variations can really shape the macro-decomposer community. For example, in Sarit Shaked, they had a lot more termites in the summer, which could be because of the specific soil conditions there or the types of plants.
Fascinating. So it's not just the total rainfall, it's all these other subtle environmental factors that are shaping the community.
Right. And this is really important for understanding how these dryland ecosystems might respond to changes in the future, especially with climate change shifting temperature and moisture patterns.
Yeah, because if those changes affect the microclimates, it could lead to changes in the macro-decomposer community, even in places with similar overall rainfall.
Exactly. And those changes could have a ripple effect on decomposition rates, nutrient cycling, the whole health of the ecosystem. It really emphasizes how important it is to consider these smaller scale details when we're studying and managing these environments.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening deep dive. We've gone from thinking about the desert as this empty wasteland to appreciating this complex web of life beneath the surface.
It's pretty incredible, isn't it? And so much of it depends on these little creatures we often don't even notice.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up, what are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive?
I think the biggest one is don't underestimate the power of decomposers. They're the unsung heroes of every ecosystem, but especially in these challenging arid environments.
Yeah, they're keeping things running. And we learned that diversity is key. Having a variety of decomposers, each with their own special adaptations, makes sure decomposition can keep going, even when conditions change.
And one last thing to remember is that these ecosystems are way more complex than we often realize. Those subtle variations in microclimate can have a huge impact on the community and all the vital processes they drive.
It really makes you want to get out there and explore. See what other secrets are hidden just beneath the surface.
Definitely. There's always more to discover.
Well, thank you so much for taking us on this incredible journey. It's been a true deep dive. And to our listeners, we hope you've enjoyed exploring this hidden world with us. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those ears open for more adventures in knowledge.